we Amber Melanie Smith, friend of HGA, and tickled to have you on, and can't thank you enough for taking the time. And as opposed to us introducing you, I'd like for you to tell folks how you got in the space because I think it's a really, really unique story. And then the work that you're doing about engaging volunteers, and then we'll get in the nitty gritty about talking about, talent and whatnot, and retaining talent in the space and avoiding burnout for volunteers. And I want to kind of like that to coalesce with like paid staff too, because I think there's, somewhat synonymous with this topic. So, yeah, Amber, just happy that you're here and tell us about what you're doing and how, like I said, how you got in the space, because I think it's a really cool story. You've been doing it for a while. So,
Oh gosh, okay, so going way back in time, so I am the founder of a nonprofit called Activate Good. It's located in Raleigh, North Carolina, and its mission is to mobilize volunteers around the community and make volunteering easier for people to get involved in. And I started the organization before I'd finished college. After a about 3 month long road trip with my best friend, where we were volunteering across the country, and we made it to just over 20 states, volunteering and doing acts of kindness in each of them before we completely ran out of money on our road trip and had to come home, as you do.
yeah, yeah, that sounds like college to me. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Definitely one of those, life transformative experiences that I highly recommend. Um, but on that road trip, just learned so much about the needs of the organizations that we visited, but also the barriers that people were facing to volunteering and getting involved. We set out on that road trip, worried that we were going to discover that if people weren't already volunteering, it was because they didn't care. But what
Yeah.
we learned actually was that they wanted to get involved, but they were overwhelmed with how to even start. So that's why we started Activate Good when we got back from that road trip all those years ago, with the mission of removing those barriers to getting people involved in the community. I grew that organization from nothing up to where it is today. We have a handful of staff, and that we can count. I know that the organization has mobilized at least 50,000 people in our local community since we got started. Um,
Cool.
but I did just transition out of that role on May
Hmm.
31st of this year so
Hmm.
that I could focus on helping change makers, not just in my local community, but outside of my local community too, through the educational content that I provide on YouTube, speaking, and helping equip change makers with some great resources. So
Just to give,
hopefully
I
that's
think,
good.
I think how many subscribers do you have in YouTube?
I just hit 70,000.
Seventy
Oh, wow,
thousand.
look at
So,
that.
to
Yeah,
give you an idea, that's a lot
that's
in
a
this
lot
space. That's a
in our
lot of
space.
subscribers. So yeah, so
Amber,
it's
tell folks. I mean,
congratulations.
the name of your channel is just your name, correct?
It's
Or
just my name for
yeah, that's
now.
what I thought. Yeah, cool. Check
Yeah,
her out.
yeah.
I'll grab it and I'll put the link in there while we're
Cool.
talking in the chat.
So
Yeah.
Amber, we were talking about before we came on, and I want to just kind of hit on a couple of things because one of the things we talk a lot about from the donor's perspective, and how we bring in more donors because, we're in the deal of getting more money in the door. But also not only from, this is from a dollar capital, but from human capital as well. We know the average is, full-time, we've got what, 2.5 full-time employees, I think is the average for nonprofits across the country, paid staff. So the big part of this is going to be powered by volunteers. So talk to us about how, we talked about burnout, because I know that's one of the biggest things that people deal with. And then we can kind of talk about how to bring more people into the fold if that's cool. Because I know that's one of the things is burnout. We see it all the time. I mean, you see somebody and like we've got, in fact, I can't believe she's not on here. We've got a dedicated volunteer. She comes on every week to learn more
Oh,
about
Bev.
raising more
Yeah.
money
Yeah.
and just works her tail off for this organization to raise money for for the different things that they do. So talk to us about that and some indications, some things that you've learned and that you talk about.
Yeah, to do that, I kind of want to zoom way out and kind of look at the big picture, like the Earth from space, right? So, just over the past couple of years, people are just tired, like across the board. Everyone,
Mhm. The
I
fatigue.
was just
Yeah.
talking to a friend of mine just before this and talking about how, during COVID, we were all sort of running on adrenaline. And what
Yeah.
happens when the adrenaline drops and fades? you're tired. You're
Crash.
extra
Yeah.
Yeah.
tired. We
Yeah.
crash. So I think we have to acknowledge that just as a phenomenon across every human right now, there's a bit of that collective exhaustion going on, right? And then you zoom into helping professions. We're talking about social workers, teachers, nonprofit professionals, all of these professionals in these positions whose job it is to focus on being of service, to helping. These are the people who are often seeing a lot of hard things happening on the front lines. You have a lot of burnout and turnover in these fields. Everyone's heard of, teacher burnout and turnover, but a
Mhm.
lot of the people I talk to who aren't already in the nonprofit world didn't realize that we're facing that trend in the nonprofit sector as well. There was a study that was done last year, and actually the survey is being done again this year to compare the data. I think it's like the Social Impact Staff Retention Survey or something. I'll have to find the link for you all. But what they found in their first survey last fall was that 74% of nonprofit professionals are looking for other jobs. And of those, 2/3 aren't sure that they're going to stay in the social impact sector at all.
Mm.
Okay, so that's on the staff side. And perhaps you've seen this in your clients as well. The turnover, some of the data is showing that the top concern of nonprofit executives right now is the turnover and retention issues related to their staff.
Keeping good people. Yeah.
Yeah. Next to that, parallel to that, we saw about a year ago data that showed us that giving trends and volunteerism trends were declining. Now, I do think there's some optimism in that we're going to start to see that on an upswing over the next year or so, but that's what the data was telling us a year or so ago.
Mhm.
So I think what we see here on the volunteer side is it's running a little bit parallel to the nonprofit professional turnover that we're seeing. But with volunteerism, there's so much more complexity because, first of all, on an individual organization level, if you don't have a solid, skilled, effective volunteer manager overseeing that volunteer workforce, you're already not going to have great retention. So there's that detail that needs to be really solid to slow down some of this. But then you have issues like some of the same things you might see on the staff side, right? Where the issues are too big, the resources feel too small, it never feels like we're moving the needle. How can we stay hopeful? And then you burn out.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a long answer for your question.
No,
Well,
but
no,
poignant.
I think it's
Poignant.
really,
Yeah.
I think it's really on point because I think, what is going on in the nonprofit sector? What do we know? Well, you can never have enough money because there's always going to be more need. And one of the things is, there's always more. It's always more. Somebody goes, well, if we could only raise another $100,000, we could help, 100 more people, whatever the number is. And, we're going to send 100 more kids, but what happens next year? Well, now we need to raise 125 more because, we've got another 25 kids that need to help. And so we see that as across the board with our clients. They're always like, yeah, it's always this accordion effect. We're either, expanding out because now we've got some money and we got a grant, or we're contracting because we've lost some funding. And so they're doing all that, which puts more pressure. We've lost 2 staff members, so that puts more pressure on the volunteers that they had, and all those things. It's just a constant deal. I do believe, now and you mentioned this, you said, you think there's some trends, and we were having a discussion with one of our national nonprofit friends. There is, in election year, there's just a lot of pressure. I don't care what it is because the
A lot of
unknown.
uncertainty. Yeah.
It's just uncertainty.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter which way it really goes. It does, but but the reality is, it's just the uncertainty of which way it's going to go. I had a guy, just a business guy, and he said, I don't care. He goes, I can deal with it whichever way it goes, but I just need to know because the rules are going to be different whichever way it works.
Sure.
And it's the same thing with fundraising, with all this stuff. And people, donors, volunteers, they have uncertainty. So then instead of maybe, committing that time, I really need to work. I've got to work this second job because, I don't have as many hours, or things like that start happening. Well, now that's over. I think there's going to be some optimism because just from the simple step, now the decision's been made, we can move on. Okay. We're not getting inundated with all this information. And I think it's just every 4 years. I've been doing this for 30 years and it's been the same way. I don't ever remember a time in the election year it wasn't this way. So I think there's something to that, but something that you mentioned. So the 74%, which is an astounding number. We know it's pretty high. I mean, we do this every day with working with nonprofit professionals. So we know there's a lot of that. But tell me, what are some of the things you're seeing or that you're talking about that we can do to stem that tide, to keep that great talent in the field, to help these, because I believe, and Trevor does, and our deal is that nonprofits are the social the safety net of our society. They're the ones that keep everything from falling to the bottom, and they fill in all the gaps.
Especially in times of need. Yeah.
And so what are some of the things that you're seeing that you're recommending to help stem that tide?
There's things that we need to do as individuals. There's things that we need to do in our organizations. And then there's things we need to do as members of an ecosystem. And I can talk about this from the perspective of a staff person, but I actually think that volunteers have a significant role to play in this too, if we're talking about volunteers, right? So obviously, the stuff on the individual side, it goes a little bit beyond your typical self-care advice, which is still important. But you really have to learn how to be an advocate for yourself. And part of starting to learn how to do that is to know yourself really, really well. You need to know what your values are. You need to know what type of work environment you operate most effectively in. I use this example, and I do a keynote talk about burnout and how to overcome it as a sector. And one of the things I talk about is how I learned about myself that I'm best suited for a startup or very, very agile, flexible environment. You don't want me in a large scale, bureaucratic, slow moving, but very stable. Yeah. I will not be happy there. I'll be happy here. So if you put me in the type of work environment that I'm not best suited for, I'm probably going to burn out because that's not where I thrive. Someone totally different could thrive in the stability and structure of that type of organization, right? So you just have to know yourself really well. So that's on the individual side. And of course, things like making sure you're actually taking time off, that's common advice. But on the organizational side, what I looked at for my keynote was this idea of hygiene motivation factors theory. Have you heard of this?
No.
Okay, it's I think it was developed by a psychologist named Frederick Hertzberg. It was talked about in the Stanford Social Innovation Review a little while ago. But what he talks about is there's two different sets of factors that influence whether you stay in your role. And I suppose this could apply to volunteering too. That'd be a really interesting application. So hygiene factors are the bare minimum baseline you have to have in a workplace in order to survive. These are things like fair compensation. It has to be a safe workplace. There has to be policies and procedures in place to make sure that you're not in danger, stuff like that. That's the bare minimum. If you don't have these elements in your organization, people are going to be unhappy. However, if you do have these elements in your organization, that doesn't mean that people are going to be happy. Does that make sense?
Just the baseline.
It's basically Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it sounds like.
Yes. So then you have your motivation factors. And these are the factors that allow people to not just survive, but to thrive in the environment. These are things like being able to trust your leaders, liking the people that you're working with, feeling like the organization actually cares about you as a human, etc. So I would actually be really fascinated to apply those same principles to the volunteer workforce. I think there could be something there. Feeling like efficacy, right? Like the things you're doing are actually moving the needle. But then you broaden out and you have the ecosystem side, right? Because even if you're really great at self-care and your organization has a great culture, we're still operating in a system that has perpetually starved nonprofits with under-resourcing them for decades and decades. So we have to agree to come together and speak up about that and do some public education on the need for investment. Jason, you talked about these organizations having to up the ante every year because the people they serve increase, like the number increases or the needs get worse, et cetera. Um, this might feel counterintuitive, but sometimes I think about the need for a bolder vision. You've got charity, which is making sure people aren't hungry day to day. And then you have systemic change, which is going upstream to stop the mechanisms that are causing people to be hungry every day, right? What would happen if we said to our donors and our volunteers, okay, this is a big number, but if we had this much money, we have a plan to end hunger in our city, right? So I know that's like, it might sound lofty
It's
or,
I was just gonna say it's pretty lofty, but awesome. Yeah, yeah.
and it doesn't
But I
even
get it
have
in
to
theory.
be,
I get it.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's it's about putting the thought into what that actually looks like
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
communicating that. Because even if you aren't
Yeah.
going to go out and raise, I don't know what number it would be, $1 billion, okay?
Yeah.
Even if you're not able to actually go out and raise that, what that statement does is it puts things in perspective for your
Mm.
volunteers and your donors
Hmm. Hmm.
and helps them see, oh, this is a really big problem. So we're going to have to invest more if we really want to move the needle in this.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Because it provides a vision. Yes.
Okay. So
Yeah.
Amber, so and I get that, having that. I think that's a good vision. So,
Absolutely.
but I'm running a nonprofit. I've got 2.5 people. I've got, 5 volunteers that I really can count on, and maybe 5 or 6 if we have an event or something. What
mhm.
are some things that I can do? Some real practical, rubber meets the road, things that I can start doing to help my team, because I look at everybody in that team, to start being things. I mean, you gave some examples, but kind of drill into that, like some practical steps that I could do, maybe like a top 1, 2, 3 that would be real helpful.
Yeah.
Love
The first is you have to create an environment in which honesty is valued and
it. Hmm.
acceptable.
Hmm.
And then immediately after that, you have to ask them what their needs are.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there because I want to ask a question. If I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Really, what that means is transparency. That way, if I need to go to the boss and say something, I can go to the boss and say something without feeling like I'm going to get, you know, griped
Difficult
out, or,
conversation. Yeah. Yeah.
it's going to be somebody's going to hold it against me for the next 2 weeks, and we're going to play little mind games. That's really what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you really want to know how to help your people, the best thing you can do is ask them.
Talk to your people. Yeah.
But if you
Yeah.
don't have a culture in which they feel like they can tell you the truth, asking them won't get you very far. So you have to do
Good.
both in tandem.
Yeah.
Well, I think the real is you have to be willing to accept the truth.
Sure.
You
That's
know,
No,
part of
for
it
because
too.
sure. Yeah.
because that's the
Yeah.
whole thing is, we don't always get answers we want to hear. Well, I
Yeah.
don't like that, but just because I don't like it doesn't mean I don't need to accept it and understand it.
Do you think that
Uh,
I think that there's been a natural progression or just seeing nonprofits kind of like work like a for-profit company over time, but not, and I mean this in the most respectful way, but a little bit behind the trend, so to speak. Like we see what's happening in the for-profit space. We're going to start, operating that way or applying these different principles. What I mean by that is, in the for-profit world, if you motivate or if you lead with fear, it's not going to work. It's going to erode your culture. People are not going to be happy, and you'll have crazy turnover. You'll probably end up out of business. Well, nonprofits are in business too, right? You know what I mean? And we lose them all the time. It just seems like there's been instead of necessarily managing with fear at the nonprofit level, it just seems like, well, this is the way we've always done it. And so we're going to continue to do this way. And there hasn't been an ushering in enough of good, strong, thoughtful talent to erode that ideology or the way that nonprofits operate, right? And I think that's also part of the reason why we're seeing this dramatic turnover. Turnover in the nonprofit space. I've been in it almost 10 years. Jason's been helping nonprofits for 30, and Amber, you've been in it right in between there for, the better part of a couple decades. Turnover has been rampant since I've been exposed to nonprofit work, you know. And I just think that there seems to be we're having the conversation, so that's the beginning, right? You're having this conversation on a daily basis. You're flying around the country talking to folks about this, in large numbers, because it's necessary. And I just feel like there's a tremendous conversation about culture and people feeling good about where they work and the work they're doing. And that needs to be injected in the nonprofit space, not just great talent, right? I mean, talk to me about, just or talk to the audience, about is there a lack is there a lack of good management, in the nonprofit world, not good talent. Obviously there's not does that make sense?
I
Can I comment on that? No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah, but
so I think it's a little more complicated.
yeah, let's talk about it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So there's a couple things at play here. One, and by
Mhm.
the way, let me just say, I think that the business world could learn a lot from nonprofits
I
too.
agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly.
Um,
Yeah.
so what I think is occurring here is, in my experience, these nonprofit leaders desperately want to innovate and invest in their infrastructure and their culture and all these things that we've just talked about will help. But those things are considered, quote, overhead, right? And
Got
so
it.
you
Yeah.
have it's been improved over the past decade, but you still have a general widespread public perception that
Yeah.
if a nonprofit invests in those things, it's not directly helping the programs and is thus bad, right? Now,
Yeah.
we know on the business side, their businesses aren't scrutinized on those sorts of operational and infrastructure costs the same way nonprofits are.
Certainly not. Yep.
I think,
Absolutely.
well, I want to agree with that. I think the most dangerous thing that a nonprofit can do is to say, 96 cents of every dollar we raise goes into this thing.
Yes,
That's
don't
the
do that.
most,
If you're on the
that's,
call, if you're listening,
yeah,
don't stop
don't
it.
do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because every dollar that, your organization is part of that cost. You guys, I think one of the things that you're saying is, part of the reason we lose it because we don't pay a fair wage. We think, well, they're in the nonprofit. We can't pay more because we've got to starve to death.
That
We need to
baseline.
be,
Yeah.
yeah. Not only do we need to we need to be a client as well. That's crazy, because that's how you keep talent, is be able to pay them. You go back to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They need to have a safe place to work. In other words, what do we need? We need safety and shelter. We need to be fed. And then, once we get those things, safety and shelter, and be able to eat, well, then it becomes about purpose,
Mhm.
and then we need to have the reason and all those things. But I completely agree. I think one of the craziest thing, this idea of, well, we really want to make sure that we're good stewards. And usually it's a board member that doesn't have to do anything that's pushing this agenda. Or somebody said, well, if we do that, we can get more donors, or some grant. I had somebody literally tell me, well, we have to do this because of a grant we have. And I said, go get another grant.
Mm-hmm.
You're
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
literally losing out on, hundreds of thousands of dollars that you could raise because you're choking on this one grant because you're trying to do that. And quite frankly, I personally think it was a accounting exercise. That had just changed their accounting, it would have been fine. But so talk to us more about that. I mean, I really, that's one thing that just gets me going. So I love this.
Oh yeah. We could talk about the overmyth all day long.
Oh yeah.
That's awesome.
It is starting to change. I don't know if anyone, on the call or watching this later has seen the new documentary that has just come out called Uncharitable.
Mm.
It's the expanded version of the famous TED Talk by Dan Pallotta he did over
I know that TED Talk
10
very
years.
well.
Yeah, that TED Talk, if you haven't seen it, go look it up. It's called The Way
It's
You Think
really
About
good.
Charity is Dead Wrong. And he
Hmm.
talks about this very issue of how we, by believing nonprofits shouldn't invest more in infrastructure, we've actually created a system in which organizations are starving and failing to meet their goals. There was a very interesting study done of Habitat for Humanity chapters a couple of years ago. And it was an exploration of what happens when you increase overhead, or as I like to call it, infrastructure, because that's what it really is.
Yeah.
Totally.
What happens when you increase that in Habitat chapters and compare their results to the organizations that invest less in their infrastructure? And what they found was that the Habitat for Humanity chapters that actually invested more in their infrastructure, they built more houses that year than the chapters that didn't. So by feeding the operations, by feeding the important core and the infrastructure of the organization, you actually had a bigger impact than the ones who were starving. And I think of the analogy of the human body and exercise, right? You can't run fast and far if you don't have any food, right?
Yeah.
Totally.
Same
Yeah. Yeah.
principle.
Yeah. No fuel. Yeah. Yeah.
I I just, yeah, that's one of the things I think, and that's where I think everybody starts leaving. You start losing staff, and therefore you're not, the volunteers get pressure. There's so many things that go into that. So I think that's really, really big. So I want to go back to your top three because that was that got us going on something. So number one, is transparency. What would be number two?
Asking them. So they
So,
were kind of, it
okay,
was a one and a two, right? So
okay,
Yeah.
yeah,
in order for asking people what they need to be useful, you have to have an environment in which people can honestly say what they need,
Yeah.
right? So those two things paired together, and then I mean the third very common sensely is do the things that they say that they need.
Yeah.
follow
Through. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I think there's something different. I think when I started in my career a long time ago, and I've helped nonprofits for 30 years, but I've been an entrepreneur. I've had my own company since I was 23. So most of my life. And, it was different whenever I started because it was very much, we were hourly, everybody's, punching the clock, coming in, going out, we paid competitively. We did all the things, try to have fun and try to do all that stuff. And and then now, there is no time clock. We don't punch any clocks around here. Everybody shows up. Everybody does their deal. We got majority of our staff work from home across the country because we do all these things. And so it's been for me even, there's been an evolution. I really think that, to your point, the way that we listen and the way that we do, having that conversation, having that deal, it's kind of like, well, how do you do it? And you said, well, ask them. It really does make a difference whenever you ask, because you make assumptions based upon, well, this is what I assume that this is going to be it. And it's just wrong. Most of the time you're wrong.
Yeah, and you have to be really careful and self-reflective here too, because what I learned years ago, because I was a workaholic, as they say, I couldn't be trusted to come up with policies that were going to be beneficial for my non-workaholic employees, right?
Because
Because
you
I
would have
held them
expected them
to my
to carry the same weight
unreasonable,
as you. Yeah. And move at the same
yeah,
pace as you.
Well,
Yeah. That's
and Trevor and I have
impossible.
talked about that a lot because,
Yeah.
and to your point, I'm a reformed workaholic.
Yeah.
If I didn't work 12 hours, at least 12 to 18 hours a day, I felt tremendous guilt. I
Yeah.
had this, I would
Yeah.
feel
There's an
guilty,
insecurity there. Yeah.
but I would transfer that guilt over to the people that worked
that's
for me
right.
as well, just like what you're talking about. And, I think that happens because in the nonprofit space, because everybody's built different.
Hmm.
Some people need to sleep 12 hours. Some people need to sleep 8, and some people need to sleep 4. Now, I know there's some health things and all people talk about that, but that's just the reality of it. And being very careful to do that. There's also, I've also seen it where and actually very effective leaders that weren't workaholics. Some of the most effective leaders I've ever been around were not workaholics. They were very efficient in the time that they had. They didn't waste any, there was no steps wasted. They got everything done, and then they're gone. And they're out doing other things to do. And then the other thing they would do is empower and trust people. I think that's probably one of the issues that as leaders happen that it took me a long time to figure out. I wonder if it's the same for you, Amber, if you can relate to this, is to be willing to trust the people that work for you to do what they say.
That typically does not come naturally for folks. Not to interrupt you in your answer, Amber.
No,
I
I think you're right on, Trevor.
Yeah, I learned that I think a little too late.
Yeah.
And
Right.
but when I did it, I became a better leader.
That's awesome.
My organization, before, I transitioned out of my role, we had some pretty strong policies in place. We had flexible, unlimited PTO, paid parental leave, all these great things. And you know what? I didn't
Nobody used them.
instigate those things. No, it was one of my coworkers who had the courage to speak up and bring these needs to my attention.
Oh, yeah.
These things are important.
Yeah. And I stepped back and I let her kind of take charge of developing the vision. And I actually became a better leader through that process.
I love that. By relinquishing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's good.
Well, and I think that's where we have,
I mean the pressure is what I mean, not the responsibility.
and I think
You
one
know
of the
what I
things
mean?
that happens in the nonprofit space is there's a lot of people that are really tough to work for, and they don't realize it. I think because they don't ever look in the mirror to look at themselves and see that. And we all can see it because we're on the outside looking in and going, golly, he's tough.
But like you
Ah,
said, I mean, you said I love that you mentioned self-awareness. I think that's a massive conversation to be had. And some of those people that are tough to work with are probably once again burning out because things aren't great. They don't understand themselves well enough to understand what their work environment should look like, where they're going to thrive, and their personal, not to get personal, but their home environment, their away from work environment. That's a big chunk of your life,
yeah.
obviously. Was back to the working with people. It's funny when Jason and I started working together, we were like, oh man, it's really really great to be working with someone that pulls equally, right? And we were like, we remember we would talk about that, and this is years
Yeah.
ago, and now it's really cool. I'm not making this about us, but we've got a 20-person team. Super super proud of it. Super fortunate for the team that we have, and I feel now like we have many roles Jason and I play and what have you, right, as leaders. But I'm kind of just tickled with the idea of getting out of people's way and making sure they have everything they need to just cook, and I love it. And it's hit me and inspired me in a way that I never even knew was possible. You know what I mean? And I feel like that's a new layer of this role, is just making sure people feel like they have everything they need so they can just go cook, as I like to say, and just do their thing because they're so darn talented and we're so lucky to have them on board. And I think that can be taken to either side of the fence, nonprofit, for profit.
Hey, does anybody have any questions? We've got, Amber's got a
Mm.
tremendous amount of information and data because she's obviously has really delved into this, has a lot of information. So if you've got a question, I'm going to ask a question. So, but while you're thinking of them, put them out there. We'll get to them. Amber,
Come on now.
if I'm a nonprofit, I'm listening to this now or later, whatever, and I'm thinking, okay, what is the first step? I see myself and I see that maybe I'm not doing the best job. I need to be better. What do you recommend to be the very first
Ooh,
step? Let's
like a
say I've
self
taken
audit.
step one.
I love that.
I'm ready to be open and transparent. I've looked at myself and said, okay, I'm ready to
I'm gonna
listen.
do better. Yeah.
What's just I mean, because practically it sounds easy, but it can kind of get muckety and all that, even though we've only maybe have 2.5 full-time employees. What do I need to do to reach out to my team to start talking to them about that?
I mean, if you're talking about a team that's like 2 to 3 employees, I feel that at that size, you should be able to have some pretty transparent and intimate conversations just around your meeting table, you know?
Mm.
And so if you haven't sparked the conversation, just spark it, bring it up, be like, hey, I've been thinking about what could we do to make this the best workplace ever? I'd love to
Mm.
hear your ideas, and then shut up and write them all down,
Sure,
right?
sure.
And then you don't even have the pressure of being like, I've been terrible in this way
Oh, I
before.
was going to ask you, is there any need to be like self-deprecating in that moment and say, hey, maybe we're having this conversation because maybe I feel like I haven't been doing the greatest job or something like that. I just want to make
Yeah.
sure that you all know that. Is there any need to be self-effacing or self-deprecating in that case?
That's really situational. I
Yeah.
mean, like if you've been having a lot of conflict or you're
Mm.
seeing a lot of turnover in your organization, it might be obvious to people that there's some kind of issue and
Mhm. Right, right,
you
right.
might
Yeah,
be
the writing's on the
wondering if
wall.
it's you.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Um,
The elephant in the
Well,
room.
that the old saying, if it's everybody else is the problem,
then
you're
you're the
the
problem.
problem.
Yeah, the common
Yeah.
denominator there. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I think here's what I'll say. Here's what really helped me. I had a a number two, a person who she was just great at being very frank, for better or
Mm,
worse, you know?
mm,
And so I knew I could always count on her to tell me the truth. And so if I wanted honest feedback about something I was doing, I
Mhm.
knew I could ask her.
yeah.
Ooh,
So if you don't
nice to
have
have that
that
person.
person
Yeah.
in your organization, like
Good
find that
call.
person,
Yeah, yeah.
even if it's hard to hear. Because if
Mm.
you have a trusting relationship, like I knew that if she was telling me something that wasn't great about myself, that it was out of love and not out of hate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well,
What's her name?
I guess they're
What was
both
her name again,
emotions.
Amber? What was her
Yeah.
Oh,
name?
yeah. Oh,
What was her
I
name?
will not voice her name here on a public
Oh, I
channel.
was gonna say everyone needs a you know who, you know what I mean? Like if her name was
Let's
Connie,
call her Sally.
everyone needs a
Yeah.
Connie, everyone
Everybody
needs a
needs
Sally.
Sally. Everybody
Seriously,
needs a
yeah,
Sally.
yeah, it's
Well,
awesome.
so, as we talk about this in having these conversations, I think one of the things that in the volunteer nonprofit, and I think it's really to do the same thing with volunteers is what I hear you saying, to be able to have the volunteers to say, hey, what would it be better? How could we do this better? How could it be
Mm.
better for you as a volunteer to feel like, number one, because I've seen a lot of volunteers just get absolutely used and abused. Oh, well, we'll get Trevor to do it because he never says no. He
He's got
always
broad
says yes,
shoulders
and
or
he'll
whatever.
do. Yeah, he can handle it. He loves doing this, and they would and justify. I've literally seen sat in a board where they justified that they could continue to use this person because well they just love it. They're so passionate about it. I'm like,
Yeah.
well, they may be passionate about it, but I think there's going to come a point where they're just not going to show up,
Yeah.
and you're going to go,
Yeah.
where did Sally go? Well,
Not Sally.
Sally found the yellow brick road and she's out of here.
Yeah.
She's departed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know what I mean? It's just that whole thing of all of a sudden somebody's gone and those are having that candid conversation. We call it here in our company having an uncomfortable conversation. Doesn't mean it's a bad conversation. It just means, hey, this is going to be uncomfortable. Uncomfortable for me, uncomfortable for you, but we're going to have one.
Yeah.
And it we're able to have them, and we have them quite often, but it's always in a very positive thing, not from a standpoint of going, hey, Trevor, we need to have an uncomfortable conversation. Sorry. It's not like that
Yeah.
at all.
Wah,
It's
wah,
just that,
wah.
this winds up coming, a lot of good stuff comes out of it every time it does.
It's
We've never,
cathartic. I think that's the
yeah,
cool part because we have that we've set in place that that level of communication where it's like I'm an open book. I tell everybody I do a really bad job of always telling people exactly how I'm feeling. Right? It's like I don't hold anything back and I don't, so we have that level like you as you mentioned previously on the episode more than once, the transparency. I was going to say I was at speaking of transparency and just getting everything out in the open. I had the good fortune of going to I was invited to a Rotary meeting last night here locally, and I got to speak, and they're so funny because it was all brevity. It was like, hey, we're in here for 90 minutes or less, no matter what. And I got up there and they said, hey, they told me to keep it brief. I said, what's the perfect amount of time? You know what I mean? For me to be up here, I was speaking to them about fundraising briefly, and they said, 0 minutes. And I go, oh, okay, cool. That kind of thing. So I knew the audience, right? But what was really fascinating is everyone was so kind. They were all very, very giving. You could tell the spirit of giving with all these people was really, really strong. The new chief of police came in and spoke, and and it was really cool. It was actually really, really fun to be invited to. But when they went through their agenda, what they have upcoming, it was like, you're doing it. No, good. Okay, and it was just like it was once again. It was not throwing everything on one person because they had broad shoulders and they did 50 fundraisers a year. It was just like they're on it. Okay, great, agreed. Everybody, boom, 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 and they aired it out. They aired out their differences right there in front of it was just done, and it was so seamless and so smooth, and everyone was on the same page, and there was nothing left to chance. And
Yeah,
it was simple and effective, and I just think that there's just too much minutia with so many of these meetings and outcomes and this and that and the other thing that
I
can
love
just
that.
yeah, you know what I mean? It's just weird. It's a small town Rotary, and it was just like, hey, they're doing it right. You know what I mean? They'll have a crab feed and raise like 80 grand. You know what I mean?
Wow.
Like, yeah, it's like it was wild, that kind of thing. So it was really, really, and you could tell also everyone was on board, and obviously all volunteer driven, right? So really, really cool to see. Yeah.
Kind of
Hey,
address what you were saying though, Jason, real quick. The volunteer side of things, I think some of the things we were talking about on the staff side apply here, right? Here's
absolutely.
something I would say to volunteers all the time. I would say, hey, I want you to really reflect on the kind of work you like to do, the skills you feel you bring to the table, and your time commitment that you have available and that you're comfortable with. Because the worst thing for me as a volunteer manager is for someone to overcommit because they're being polite and
Mm,
then they disappear or drop out unexpectedly. I would rather know this is John. He's got 2 hours a week. He only wants to do this kind of activity. This is where he feels like he shines.
yep.
And we have that like honest self-awareness on both sides. I can put John to work and I know I can count on John in his terms. John's not going to get walked all over to your point about your story.
Hmm.
But then I'm also going to be able to fit John where he works best in the organization. So if you're not already encouraging your volunteers to have that same self-awareness and really get honest with themselves and communicate what those boundaries and preferences are, do it now, because that I think will reduce a good bit of volunteer turnover. On the organization side, though, you have to really think hard about how you're tying the volunteers' engagement to the ultimate KPIs and outcomes of the organization, right? If you're an organization that's aiming to reduce food insecurity in your city, how do the volunteers actually lead to that outcome? And even if it's administrative work that is harder to understand how it fits, being able to tell that story really well is going to create a lot of motivation for your volunteers who are there because they want to see those outcomes too.
So we
Good.
we talk about something a lot about, it's a marketing statement, and it could be whatever. Like here at HGA, we say we help nonprofits raise more money. Doesn't matter who you talk to, anybody in our organization, if somebody goes up and says, "Hey, what do you do?" "Oh, I help nonprofits raise more money." They know that that's what they're an important piece in that whole process. And I think same thing happens in, if we send kids with cancer to camp. Doesn't matter if you're administrative, whatever, having that knowledge, that idea, that identity for what they do with the organization is really, really helpful, because that's where, they get the juice from, because that's what they're doing. They're getting an emotional return. They're not getting paid money. They're going to get an emotional return, hopefully, that they can carry with them, that's going to be more substantive than possibly even if it was monetary. But
Early
it's
and
also
often.
the same thing for the employees. If they can be able to verbalize what it is that they do, what is the mission that they're helping happen, because that's going to be, to your point, maybe they could get a little bit more money. But if that emotional piece of it is enough, sometimes that will overcome a little bit of discrepancy in pay that they might reach in another place or the private sector.
Kind of like
And
the famous janitor story at NASA, right? Was
yeah,
it JFK's walking through now? Is this correct, JFK? He's walking through NASA and he meets a janitor, and the janitor's having the best time sweeping the floor. And he's like, JFK asks him, "What do you do here?" And he says, "I help people get to the moon." And
Oh, wow.
he's
exactly.
so aligned
Great.
with his purpose at
I love
NASA,
that.
right? Hopefully
That's
I got that story
exactly.
correct.
You're
I
close.
love
I
that,
remember
man.
the story. It's close. And, that's the whole thing, is getting, and I'd forgotten that story. That's a great story. Amber, I hear you saying this about, getting the people aligned, doing this. There's one thing, we've got just about 10 minutes left. You talked about having somebody dedicated to head the volunteer effort, having that
Mm.
person. Back again, we're talking about limited funds, limited staff. What are some recommendations that you make for somebody in that, listening, that they could do to maybe start to fill that position, or what can we do?
Yeah, if you're talking about filling it as a paid staff position, there's some interesting research out there about funder perceptions of volunteerism and volunteer management that I'd like to go back and look at it more actually. But the study talks about some techniques to demonstrate the ROI to funders, because as it stands, funders don't seem to be able to fully make the connection between a strong volunteer base and achieving the outcomes of the organization. Now, as volunteer managers and leaders, we know that there's a connection. Otherwise, we wouldn't do this, right? So getting better at telling that story and articulating that, and also framing volunteer engagement as an outcome, because when you involve your community in a community issue, a social issue, that has all sorts of wonderful results for the volunteers and for the community as well. Communities that volunteer more also have more participation in voting. They have more
Mm.
likelihood of helping your neighbors. They're also
Mhm.
more likely to donate money. So volunteerism is part of the civic fabric. That's just good for everybody.
Mm.
But nonprofits can do a better job of telling the story of how all that works. And if we can do that, hopefully we can wrestle some of that funding into the volunteer manager pool to be able to hire some amazing staff there.
Well,
If
I think your point about funding, I think that's really important for us to hear, because that's what we're in the fundraising world. And to your point, sometimes we get so caught up in separating all that, back to the whole point, 96 cents of every dollar goes into services and all that stuff. where we get away from that. And, when we talk about that, and I think having those candid, transparent conversations with donors, especially the people that give you the most money, they're your biggest fans,
Mm.
will have a bigger impact. I don't think, I know because my experience says this, they're going to be far more understanding, far more buying in, far more understanding to see the big picture of the mission. But I see a reluctance on a lot of nonprofits. Well, he's my biggest donor, and I don't really want to say, I don't want to talk to him about that because I just, and it's like this fear. I'm like, that's exactly the person you need to talk to.
Sure.
Because
That
they're
goes to
not
the
just
donor
gonna,
perspective too. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
because
Yeah, I mean, someone giving you a lot of money isn't doing it when they don't trust you. So
that's
that has
right.
to
Good
go both
call.
ways, right?
That's
Well, they've
right.
also earned
Absolutely.
it. They've also earned that conversation, right? Or
Yeah,
that
they're a
input,
big
right?
stakeholder, and if you're saying, "Look, I really want to start this initiative. We need to go get another part-time. It's a part-time position. We're going to try to do this, and we need another $35,000 a year, or what? I mean, I don't know what
Yeah.
make the numbers up to be whatever they need to be."
Yeah.
Having those conversations, what my experience tells me, that's when you'll get people leaning forward because they do care about the organization. They do see that, and having that transparency, I think, goes up and down, which I believe, and we all think we're going to be transparent, but I think that having that goes up and down for the
Yeah.
betterment of the organization every time.
There's
Yeah.
a good chance that person that's given that much money has an idea on how to run a company. There's a pretty good chance that has been in that same position
Yeah.
about, hey, we need to hire this person so it'll allow us to grow. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So it's like they
Yeah.
actually might be a quote unquote expert in the space, right? And be able to give you some
Any
good
grants
feedback.
out there for this kind of stuff that you've seen, Amber?
Some are starting to come around. Some
Yeah.
foundations are starting to come around.
Yeah.
I'll have to go look up where this research is because I think it's very interesting. There's some out there, but I think even if there isn't a grant that says we fund volunteer managers, there are grants that want to see your programmatic impacts happen, and you can make the case that you're going to reach them when you have a dedicated volunteer manager, right?
Mhm.
And to your point earlier, the biggest donors I ever got for my organization were the ones who, when I had a conversation with them about what was going to move the needle and how it was adequately paid staff and how I needed to hire more people, they not only were they supportive, they got excited. And I think
Yes.
if I were like, I don't have the means to be a major donor, but if I did, I would love the opportunity to provide the kind of support that would exponentially increase an organization's ROI. If
It's
I
got to be
provide
people. Yeah.
$10,000 and you buy a bunch of meals with it, and then those meals are consumed and that's it, But if I invest $100,000 in a staff person who can then go on and raise enough money to 10x the number of people you can serve, that's an exciting impact for me as a donor,
No
right?
question.
Absolutely.
You're speaking the language
Absolutely.
now. Yeah, absolutely. It's true. It's true. It can only happen with people. That's the thing. Absolutely. It's good.
If anybody's
Really
out there
good.
and you want to have you'd like to hear more about this or talk about this, feel free to sign up for one of our coaching sessions, hjfundraising.com, free coaching. We have this. We're going to send a recording out tomorrow. I believe it'll go out tomorrow after this. It'll have this
Mhm.
information. We're going to put Amber's information. If you've got questions for Amber that come up after this, I have
Mhm.
no doubt she would love to hear from you, and to do that. So Amber, thank you so much for being here. We're going to give something away, so don't take off real quick. I've got a winner. I just got to get the handy dandy
Thanks,
wheel.
Amber. Really appreciate you coming. It's
Yeah,
awesome.
this is fun.
Cool. I know. Yeah, you like talking about this stuff. That's awesome.
She's a good fit with us because that's what we like to do. We love to talk about
We
this
just like
stuff.
talking.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we just like
great.
talking all the time.
I like hearing
All
you talk,
right.
man.
Okay, we've got a winner, Christopher Tuberville. You're our winner today.
Nice, Christopher. All right,
Congratulations.
man.
Yeah,
Cool.
so I'm going to share my
Far out.
screen. Here's the wheel, and it's coming up. And all right, just reach up, touch the screen, hit the spin button, and
Caribbean artificial
goes.
intelligence. I'm curious to see what that is when you unpack it, Chris. If you win that, that'd be great. Just kidding. It means all inclusive. Oh, $500, man. From the
Wow.
HGA Vault.
All
Come
right.
on. Right
So
on. Right on.
congratulations. You just got $580. That means you can use that to any item to use in future fundraising.
Nice.
And
Nice.
we're so excited to be able to do that. And
Far out,
congratulations.
Chris. Nice job, man. Awesome. That'll come in 4 easy installments of 125. Just kidding. But hey, Chris, thanks so much for coming. Thanks everybody else for coming. Thank Amber, please. Can you all do us a favor and thank Amber by going to her YouTube channel if you haven't already and
Yeah.
subscribing and
Yay.
Let's help her
yeah,
get to
leaving a comment.
71,000.
What's that now?
Let's help her get to 71,000.
Yeah, we can do that today, man. We got a lot of influence, you know what I mean? Thanks so much, Amber. Really appreciate you even coming and it was awesome. And yeah, like I said, reach out to Amber on LinkedIn. She's easy to reach there and check out her YouTube channel. I got the link right there in the chat, but very easy to find her, Amber Melanie Smith. Thanks so much for coming. Really appreciate you.
Ew.
Adios,
All right.
everybody.
See you, everybody.
We'll see you
Enjoy
back
your
next
Thursday
time.
afternoon. Thanks, Jay.
Have a
Talk
great
to you
one.
soon.
See
Bye,
you,
everybody.
brother. Bye-bye.